What is going on, guys? Welcome back to another episode of the Adapt Performance Podcast. You are in for an absolute treat today. I'm not going to lie to you. I'm going to tell you it straight. We are joined by Justin Kuehn, okay? And Justin was kind enough to give up an hour of his time at 4:30 in the morning. So he's American, so he's over there, and so he's not my first American, but he's the first person doing it overseas. So it's interesting for me to trial this podcasting app actually and see how it works in that sense. This was an absolute masterclass of an episode. I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. You need to listen to this. You need to take some notes on it because this is very much a underspoke about topic. It's very much an understood topic in the world of strength and conditioning and athletic performance, and I hold my hand up with that as well, and I say there's elements of our game and there's elements of our knowledge base that should be improved. And this is probably one of mine. So yeah, it was a very selfish episode. I'm not even gonna say that it wasn't. We get into it. We cover what is low intensity conditioning, what are some of the benefits of it, how can you actually use that in your training to benefit your performance. We then get into what are some of the differences between low intensity and high intensity conditioning, from an adaptation standpoint. And then we also get into a little bit more kind of, I guess you could call it the sport specific side of, how does this affect skills and how does this actually impact, you on competition day. So this was honestly so good. What I want you to do before you kind of get into the episode is Justin has written a book on this, okay? So go and get that book. I've read quite a few conditioning books, and this was one of my favorites, super clear to understand, really kind of direct, gives you the information that you need, was written in a conversational way. So it doesn't feel like you're just getting bogged down with studies and lingo that, ultimately I'm just not that interested in. So go and check that out. It's called Blue Crew. I'm going to put the information in the show notes below, okay? Honestly, you will not regret that one. I'll put his information in the show notes below as well, so go and follow him to just put out content related to this topic. So yeah, I'm chuffed. He was an absolute trooper with this one. So I had a little bit of a technical issue. So most people listen to this podcast, but there are a few that do look at it on YouTube. And my camera started shaking mad, and I'm thinking as it started going, oh no, what's going on here? It's like I was on a boat or an earthquake or something. So I felt motion sick looking at my own camera. So I think, he's done well not to vomit on this one. So cool. Without further ado then, let's get into the episode. This is me and Justin. So what I want to do, Justin, real quick, mate, can you just introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about who you are, what you're currently doing, and where you've been in the past. That'll just be really nice for listeners just to get up to speed.
Yeah, so currently I am working with the United States Army as a contracted strength and conditioning coach, part of what's called their holistic health and fitness program. It's an all-encompassing resource that's kind of designed to bring the different lanes that a professional sports team might have. So dietitians, athletic trainers, physical therapists, occupational therapists, sports psychology, and then strength and conditioning, and provide that to the soldiers themselves, because obviously you're talking about, individuals who have a very stressful job and a lot of demands that they have to be prepared for. Historically, from the strength and conditioning lane, physical training has always been handled in-house and has been the responsibility of what's called a non-commissioned officer, NCO. And previously, before the latest updates a few years ago, the Army's physical fitness test was push-ups, sit-ups, and running. And so training people for that was relatively easy and relatively simple. But with that came a lot of overuse and overtraining injuries, because there's a huge emphasis on just running and ruck marching, and that led to knee injuries, shin splints, low back pain. And when the Army shifted to its latest test called the Army Combat Fitness Test, that incorporated hex deadlifting, a medicine ball throw, different events that required a much more nuanced and complex approach to training. And so I kind of got pulled into this after my previous stop before he was working as a graduate assistant with North Dakota State University. I had been primarily working with the wrestling team and the throwers for the track and field program there. And so that was even a way I started to dive into this conditioning realm from working through wrestling. But prior to that as well, I had stops in the private sector at Acceleration Sports Performance, and then also started out my career within strength conditioning as a volunteer intern at the University of Iowa. But beyond that, I played a lot of sports growing up. I kind of got into the industry from my brother Scott, who works at LSU, and he was someone that for the majority of my life, I had wanted to be a college basketball coach. He was the one that encouraged me to go into exercise science as kind of to bridge that gap where if I was going to become a sport coach, having that background understanding in anatomy and physiology and stress and how to actually apply load management to humans, he kind of pushed me in that so I would have a higher level understanding as you and I know that that's a huge gap often between strength and conditioning and the sport coach is just that understanding of what we're trying to do versus the broad terms of, oh, I want them to be more fit or they need to be stronger, but actually being able to articulate what that means in the context of the demands of the sport. And, 2 months into my first internship, that's when I kind of realized that through the access strength coaches get to athletes, that there was just a lot more of a hands-on component. You get to see them year round. And I had always valued once I started to get into the weight room, if you talk to people that knew me growing up, I was not a weight room guy. I was the scrawny, lanky kid that avoided the weight room at all costs. But as I started to really get into it, understand it better, and saw the impact it had on myself, my performance on the court and just the overall confidence it gives you, became something that I really wanted to pursue as a career.
Man, that's awesome. And I can remember when I first started following you. Actually, I went back onto your Instagram today just to kind of see what year it was, and it was when you was at North Dakota, and it was you did a post around wrestling neck strength, so in end range. And that was the first
hmm
time I'd ever seen that, and I was like, "Wow, that's brilliant! Like that's absolutely quality." And I think since then, it's broadened my horizons a little bit. How I think about just injuries in general, and protecting against worst case scenario or ranges that don't necessarily get touched in the conventional sense. That's not something I want to kind of cover today, but I can remember seeing that, thinking, "Yeah, you're good shit. This is good."
The funny thing about that, where that whole realm of training came from, is because prior to that point, I'd been a big subscriber to the manual neck work, a lot of the traditional training you see around the neck. And what actually kind of led me down that rabbit hole of training the neck that way is we were doing a photo shoot for our wrestling team in the preseason. And one of our heavyweights got injured from a guy who was trying to do a throw, and one guy was ready for it, the other one wasn't, and he ended up landing in that position with just his neck fully flexed, and you got a 280-pound human on top of you, and that's how he tweaked it. And so I started to think, like, what are we really doing at those end ranges? Because those tend to be the most exposed areas from a force generation standpoint. And, having started gotten into wrestling myself, the other GA at our school, he was a former collegiate wrestler. So he would take me up on the mats. And I remember, all the hand fighting, the collar ties, like the stress I would feel on my neck from that. And it tends to be in a lot of those mid ranges. And so we always talk about, training should give you what the sport isn't already providing. And, through my few practices of going through wrestling and, at half the intensity, half the volume that those guys were, you realize that those mid ranges get quite a bit of stress, and those aren't really where the injuries are happening. They're happening in those spots where you just end up in some really, really uncomfortable positions in a very extended position. And so kind of went down the rabbit hole of isometrics and started to apply it. And we had really good results. Only had one neck injury the entire year, which was that photo shoot injury, which in a sport like wrestling is a good bit of luck at the end of the day. I'll admit that as well, but still kind of gave me some confidence that we were trending in the right direction.
Yeah, mate. It's whatever the mechanism of discovery, whether it's a photo shoot or not, it's an absolute gem. And sometimes those little lessons come out of the weirdest of places, eh? Um, so what I want to basically get into, mate, is I've read Blue Crew. I thought it was absolutely amazing. I'm going to make a big plug for that, and I think everybody should buy this. If you are listening to this podcast, you're obviously interested in low intensity conditioning, and you probably don't understand it to the level that you want to. So Justin's book was honestly one of the best books I've actually written is written in a really clear way. I'm not super smart. So actually having somebody write it in a conversational manner, but also can drag you up to his level in terms of research and actually understanding stuff was really good for me. So go and buy that. And my question to you, Justin, is what got you started down the rabbit hole of low intensity conditioning then?
So it definitely originated from working within the sport of wrestling because, for those who aren't familiar, that's a sport where it's very much a culture of how much work you can do, how much intensity can you do. And there really is no undulation of stress or this idea of like hard days, easy days. Like all conditioning is just meant to be exhaustive. And when I went into working with that sport, I had absolutely no background in it. I still remember my first conversation when I took over for the team day one was, guys, I've never even accidentally watched a wrestling match in my life, so I have no idea what it is you do. But you guys were always the weird kids in high school that were just always sweating. You were walking around in sweats. But I'm also someone who I enjoy being a beginner at something and having the opportunity to learn. And I was like, give me time. I will learn this sport. I will learn everything I can. But the more I kind of got involved in it, I would see, whether it was some of our higher level wrestlers or lower level ones, is the frequency, and not even our program, but across the country, the frequency with which guys would gas out essentially, in a sport where it's not like it's similar to freestyle, but American has a wrestling style called folk style. So it's a 3-minute round, a 2-minute round, and a 2-minute round. But you would have guys that routinely might be gassing out early into the second round. And for a sport where you only wrestle one match in a duel, that for me, there was something missing there. And so I went down the rabbit hole of reading Joel Jamison's Ultimate MMA Conditioning. And, obviously for a lot of people, that's where they first got exposed to the idea of left ventricular eccentric hypertrophy and cardiac output, this low intensity concept. And at the time I kind of read it, made sense. And so I adhered to it vaguely and broadly, but I never went deep enough into it. And then as I started to get into the tactical setting where, endurance is everything, these guys place a huge premium on running, but also talking about preparing them for the demands of the job where, sport, you have these concrete work to rest ratios, these match durations. Being a soldier, if you're deployed and you're on a mission, there is no work to rest ratio. There are no average demands. The length of a mission, the length of, if you get into a firefight could be 4 hours, it could be 18 hours. And so how do you prepare somebody to be, from an energy system standpoint, robust to those demands and be able to recover and reproduce those high intensity outputs? And, kind of like I think strength and conditioning did, and something I mentioned in the book, when we wanted to get our athletes stronger, get our clients stronger, we went to powerlifting coaches. When we wanted to get bigger, we went to, bodybuilding coaches. But then when it came to improving endurance, for some reason, we didn't really go to endurance coaches. And, we didn't look at your track and field, your cross country skiing, your cyclists, your marathoners, and what are the principles that they apply that help build these athletes who sustain some truly phenomenal work rates. There's the video that circulated around when Eliud Kipchoge ran his sub 2 hour marathon, and they would have that treadmill running, and it's about 13 miles per hour, I believe. I couldn't tell you the kilometers per hour conversion, but they would have people hop on it and see how long they could hold the pace for. And majority of people were lasting a minute, maybe if that. And you come to realize that for, what is that guy doing that allows him to sustain such a high output? And you see this model of very polarized training where, relative to his maximal speed or his race pace, he spends an overwhelming majority of his time training at very, very slow speeds. And so that's kind of where I started to just go down this rabbit hole. And, again, I start with a couple research papers. There's usually a couple papers cited within each of those that, picks my interest, and I take that and I run with it. And again, it was just something where the more and more I read and I started to understand the physiology of it and more importantly, the results of it, because at the end of the day, obviously that's the language that within sport performance we want to speak is what are the results, that I just started to see the tremendous value. And as I shared more and more clips, I had an opportunity to interact with different practitioners and really get a better understanding of the principles and of the rationale behind this. And ultimately just led to me really spending about the last 2 years trying to dive as deep into this topic as I could.
Love it, mate. So I guess let's not tease them anymore then. You're the first person I've had to speak around this topic of low intensity conditioning. So let's kind of start from the beginning. Like, what are the benefits then? Like, what are the physiological changes that we're seeing from the type of work that you've been prescribing with your guys?
So you can kind of look at it on both ends of the spectrum. And something I emphasize, there's the health piece to this and there's the performance, and they really go hand in hand. But so obviously there's that at the cardiac level within the structure of the heart, there is that left ventricular eccentric hypertrophy. And so essentially increasing the diameter of the left ventricle itself, which allows it to fill up with more blood. So every time it contracts, there's more potential to push out more blood and with that more oxygen to supply. So that's why you see your endurance athletes, those that are highly trained, have resting heart rates in the low 40s, the upper 30s. My mom is an Ironman, and she actually, like, her resting heart rate will float in the upper 30s to low 40s, which is just phenomenal. She's an insane athlete. But so you get something like that where, from a cardiac stress standpoint, the less frequently your heart needs to beat, the less stressful that is on you, and it allows you to sustain lower heart rates to produce the same amount of cardiac output because that stroke volume is increased. Then we talk about a lot of the other adaptations, one of the biggest one being mitochondrial volume, which, from if you remember from your high school, anatomy classes, mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, and that couldn't be more true. But ultimately, in order to produce energy and to manage the amount of lactate that gets produced during intense exercise, during those bouts that, we all agree that high intensity work is important, and especially in the context of sport, those are the actions that underpin success. Like, there's no sport where walking or slow jogging is the movement that precedes, a scoring opportunity. But in the constraints of sport and in the environment where you're going to be sprinting at times, changing direction, you're accumulating all this fatigue, your ability to recover quickly is all about how do you manage that metabolic stress, and having the mitochondria available to take that lactate, convert it back into usable ATP is something that's extremely important. And if you look at the research on what drives increases in mitochondrial content, it's training intensity doesn't really have a strong relationship to it, whereas training volume, just the amount you do in totality, is the number one correlate. And from a standpoint of, we know our athletes are practicing, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 hours a week. They're accumulating a lot of that moderate to, high intensity volume. So one of the biggest values of low intensity conditioning, and specifically incorporating it off feet, is you're getting that accumulation of volume that you need to drive those changes at the cellular level without increasing cumulative fatigue levels and actually accelerating recovery, because there's a good amount of research showing that by training at this proper low intensity range, you're going to increase your parasympathetic tone, your rest and digest system. So it's also going to help them balance their autonomic nervous system and recover better on a day-to-day basis, just from a nervous system standpoint.
So heaps of benefits then, heaps of benefits. How does that really look then? So from a loading parameters standpoint, like you mentioned volume before, general intensity, if you're going to start prescribing low intensity conditioning for somebody, where would you kind of begin, and how does that look for most people?
Obviously, the answer within our field is always it depends. I think if you have the access to, so there's a lot of misconceptions around heart rate training and around what is low intensity. And I've been the first to admit, and I did a post on this lately, how heart rate is not the end all be all for determining what zone you should be in. What we're actually looking at when we talk about zone 2 is more about your lactate levels. But obviously the average person is not going to have access to testing that and testing it on a regular basis. But when we take the research and we pull from different studies looking at relative exercise intensity, the response to blood lactate, and we can look at muscle oxygenation levels, RER values, a host of different things, we can provide some general guidelines. And heart rate is something that most of us have access to nowadays on a regular basis, whether it's a watch, it's a chest-based monitor. I'm partial to chest-based monitors. They tend to be much more accurate. The wrist wearables, especially if you are doing something like running or an airdyne where your upper body's involved, I've noticed in my own experience that the actual accuracy of it tends to go a little bit way too outside the norm. But I've kind of given the broad generalization of although Joel Jamieson will tell you it's 120 to 150 beats per minute, my research and my experience is that really 130 beats per minute is kind of the higher end I would go for anyone first getting into this training. And I encourage them not to try to float that line, because although we have this huge obsession with chasing the optimal stimulus, with this type of training, we should be much more comfortable committing our type 1 errors. So undershooting on the intensity, but knowing that there's good research out there to support that even at much lower relative intensities, you can still derive a good portion of the benefits. But if we drift into that zone where our lactate levels are getting above that 2 millimole mark, and we're starting to get into a zone where the accumulation of it exceeds the clearance rates, we can sustain that output for a while. So we might still think we're in low intensity. We're not going to feel like we're out of breath or exhausted, but we're not deriving the same benefits, because metabolically we're not in the same situation where our body's effectively managing it. And so I like the idea of keeping it below 130 beats per minute, somewhere between 110 and 130. And in terms of the volumes, this tends to be the part that most people struggle with. You're not going to see much benefit if you're doing 2 or 3 20 to 30-minute sessions a week. You may see a small benefit, but truly, if you want to see improvements to your heart rate recovery, to your resting heart rate, we're talking volumes in the neighborhood of anywhere from 3 upwards to 6 hours. I think the longer the duration of your sport or the more intense the demands, the more of a value there is for this. And even in sports like soccer, where they get a tremendous amount of low intensity work through the sport. There's, Tim Gavitt has research that I believe like 75% of the time in a match is spent at speeds lower than like 3 miles an hour or 4 miles an hour. But even in a sport like that, they conducted a study in professional Korean soccer players where the only change they made to their preseason training was they included 3 hours a week of low intensity running. And in these soccer players, it was anywhere between like 3.6 miles an hour and 5 miles an hour. And they all had significant improvements to their heart rates at associated relative speeds and also their lactate levels. So to me, if in a sport like soccer, where we know they get a lot of low intensity work in, there's still tremendous value from getting just 3 hours a week of it for 9 weeks straight. I think that's a good supportive argument for any sport can derive benefits if you're looking to improve those high intensity outputs and make them more sustainable.
That's awesome, mate. That's awesome. I think one of the things you mentioned there, and this is, I was thinking ahead of time, like, right, what are the pros, what are the cons, what do people struggle with, what do people enjoy, and that piece around volume and total, time spent doing it that's probably the biggest downside for people that either don't enjoy it or ultimately don't have the time, I guess, of working. So from somebody that's been like prescribing this for people and doing it yourself, what are your tips? Like, how do we get around that? What are your kind of in the trenches, bits of nuggets for us?
So I think first and foremost, you have to get a certain level of trust for this training, because it is counterintuitive to even myself as a strength coach. It runs counterintuitive to anything that makes sense, because this pace you're going to be training at, especially if you do incorporate it through something like running, is going to be so obscenely slow that it's just mentally, it's hard to wrap your head around. This is making me more fit. This is making me better conditioned, because it's a conversational pace. You're sweating a little bit, but you're not leaving the session completely dragging yourself. So the first thing is kind of trying to tie the data to whatever population you're working with. So, for me, it might be pulling research studies from simulated combat tasks with my soldiers. It'll also be pulling research from, endurance athletes and marathon runners, because again, these guys, everything is all about your 2-mile run time, or if you're trying to become a ranger, your 5-mile run time. And so if I can pull research saying, all right, well, here's what the best runners in the world do, and here's their split of training intensity, kind of connected in on the front end. And then it is about, encouraging them to at least give it a shot. And if it doesn't work, to reflect on it, but having that confidence in the results myself to know it will. And then ultimately, it's about trying to build it into their lifestyle, because I think bigger picture beyond just performance, again, there's such huge health impacts to how this improves, all-cause mortality, risk of cardiovascular disease, which is the number one killer worldwide. I think it's a third of all deaths globally are attributed to cardiovascular disease. And so getting them to apply that and understand like the benefits to health and performance. And then, myself personally, I would never do one of these sessions if I didn't have my phone with me and couldn't put on like a Netflix show, a podcast, whatever it is, because when you're spending 45, 50, 55 minutes just going at a slow pace on a stair climber or stationary bike or an Airdyne, you'll go mad if you're doing that for 4 to 6 hours a week, weeks on end. And so whenever people tell me they don't have time for it, I tend to call bullshit, because knowing how people love TV shows, there's so many good shows out nowadays that all I'm asking is for you to take an activity you might normally already do in watching, your Netflix, and find a way to bring that with you to the gym. So whether it's first thing in the morning or it's in the evening, bring your phone with you, your tablet, your laptop, prop it up, and you can kill an hour watching a show while going at this super slow intensity. And so now you're killing two birds with one stone. You're being a lot more productive with your time versus just sitting on the couch. And I think, especially within the guys in the soldiers in the military setting that I've got to do it, all of them have had these just sizable improvements to like being able to sustain running paces that were much faster than they were able to before, and without the shin splint pains they usually get, without the knee pains they usually get, because that is a huge reason I tend to stay away from accumulating this on feet, is that, especially for athletes, they're already on their feet, jumping, cutting, running, accumulating all those micro stressors, that if we try to build it in through something like running, you're adding a lot more impact volumes that are just unnecessary and likely going to lead to those stress fractures, those stress reactions down the road. So getting it off feet, bring your favorite show, or if there's even something where you could have, if you're in the team sports setting, having guys watch film or listen to a certain podcast, and you can make it kind of a team building activity. Those are great ways to incorporate it and kind of build it into their lifestyle without making it as monotonous as it already is.
That's gold, mate. And I think I'd echo that exact thing. It's boring. It's boring. I don't enjoy it, but it's something that I've seen a lot of benefit in doing. And you know what? It is built in a little bit more. And I do exactly what you said there. I'm a big podcast guy. I like it. Yeah, I obviously make them, but I consume them heavily as well. And it ticks so many birds with that one. Well, I messed that saying up there. It hits so many birds with one stone. Like, it's just perfect. So the next question for me then, and this takes me back to like when I first started getting into lifting, and I was big on T Nation and I was big on Charles Poliquin. He was the guy, and
you do well in American strength and conditioning.
I bet I would, mate. I bet I would. It's weird though, because over here, right, not a lot of people know like who Charles Poliquin is or was actually. He seems like he's really kind of been wiped away. Which is interesting, actually, because he was such a pivotal part of my reading back then. And obviously I follow a lot of, US and Australian guys, and it's still very much a part of the culture at the collegiate level, it seems.
Yeah, it's one of the things I identified where, as I got further into the, understanding this field and specifically American strength conditioning, I think there's a very clear kind of dichotomy between American strength conditioning and, European, Asian strength conditioning, where we are kind of, our industry came from, three disciplines. We came from powerlifting, we came from bodybuilding, and we came from Olympic weightlifting. So when you look at the approach the American model takes, those are the three methods that we tend to apply to think they solve everything. And, collegiate strength and conditioning as an industry started back in the 60s with Boyd Epley and the Nebraska football team, which is, what helped our industry come to fame. And you look at the methods he was applying then, and at the time they were novel. And because of that, you would see teams that when they adopted a strength and conditioning program, even though what they were doing was very simple in nature by our standards today, it had profound effects. You had teams that would go from 2-9 or, complete like 0-win seasons to the next year they'd turn it around and they'd be 9-3, 10-2, undefeated, winning championships. And that was just from the inclusion of your most basic strength training ever. But unfortunately, that was back at a time when the difference between doing nothing and doing something was profound. We're now 6 decades into this industry being around, and we still have coaches that are applying those same ideas because it is that idea of, oh, well, it worked for them back then, so it works for us now. There's no program you can really go into these days where if the only thing you change is their strength training regimen, that suddenly you're going to see this complete 180 turnaround. Because as we know, at the end of the day, the most important thing to sport performance is the technical tactical development. It is how good are you at your sport. And as a basketball fan myself, I'll say it's been a pleasure seeing a lot of these European players who are dominating the NBA, guys like Nikola Jokic, Luka Doncic, that athletically are a fraction of the athlete of the modern American player, but they just carve up the league. I mean, Nikola Jokic, so many guys talk about, even the way he plays, he doesn't look like he's fully coordinated. It doesn't look like his body is on the same page. But then he has 40 points, 20 rebounds, and 15 assists, and every guy in the league will tell you it's impossible to guard him because he just understands how to use his body and he understands the technical side so well. And so I think for coaches, like we like to define our job and measure our job through things like strength and power in the conventional sense, through an Olympic lift, because it's very easy to measure, and it's a way of us trying to establish credibility amongst our peers versus understanding that at the end of the day, the thing that matters the most is the sport, and that the way you use a barbell or the way you use an implement is just general. There's nothing in the weight room that happens that is specific to the court or specific to the field, but there's a large cohort in our industry that's still obsessed behind this idea of just bigger, faster, stronger. It's that simple. But
Mhm.
really, if that were true, it'd be a lot, our industry would be a lot easier than it is. So it's something where, and especially in the conditioning side of things, no one's diving into it that deep. I look at all the innovations that have come out of the strength training side of, velocity-based training, your reps and reserve concepts, all these different, waves, and we're taking these methods from super accomplished powerlifting coaches or bodybuilding coaches. But then you look at it abstractly, it's like we're not working with powerlifters, we're not working with bodybuilders. Is that what they actually need? But unfortunately, we're all subject to dogmatic thinking, and it's hard to break an industry off of these things that they've propped up their identity on, rather than having real discussions surrounding what's the core of the problem, what do these athletes need, and how can we provide them that stimulus.
And it's a really interesting, I guess, problem or scenario we find ourselves in as strength and conditioning coaches because, you just said it there. It's like everything we do is really general. And do we know whether that really influences the results in the end? And it's difficult. And I think it can be seen as quite a hostile environment for S&C coaches when they're vying for their jobs and they need to prove that they are making change and they are not making people worse. And that leads us down the route of, you mentioned it earlier, around injury data. It's like, okay, well, if I can somehow lean into that as I didn't reduce injuries or I didn't, or I stopped people from getting more injuries, that's good. But we know how much we can actually control that. So if people do get injured, was that then your fault? It's like, it's such an interesting topic. And it's a little bit different for me at the moment being more in the private sector, but that problem before was something I felt hard. It's like, how do I protect myself? And I guess that kind of comes from the top a little bit as well, and also from us as coaches trying to educate up and educate down and be managed and manage. It's interesting. This is not the way I thought we'd go with this conversation, but I'm gonna roll with it. What's your thoughts on that then? How do we push the industry forward from that context we just discussed?
solving the problems of S&C.
Mate,
I mean,
I know it's early in
no,
the morning
it's
for you. I'm forcing you to think on your feet.
oh no, I mean I think these are the conversations that need to be had, and I think the most important place it starts from, and we can kind of tie this into the whole conditioning argument, is being open-minded. I think one of the most frustrating things is we have this attachments to just, coaches always talk about master the basics, do the fundamentals, keep it simple. But our understanding of what the basics are, what the fundamentals are, what it means to keep it simple should adapt over time. Again, we're talking about an industry that's been around for 60 years in any sense of the word. And there's a level of, I think it's just arrogance in this field about the idea that we have it figured out. When we talk about something like Olympic lift, like you see all the debates, do you Olympic lift or loaded jump? Do you back squat or front squat, bilateral, unilateral? And all of these arguments are just missing the forest for the trees. And, you have coaches who, and it's something I've seen as I've promoted my kind of low intensity movement within the field of strength and conditioning, because, I can't speak to, European coaches, but at least the prototypical American strength coach, if you're not familiar, tends to be more of the meathead nature. They're a power lifter who doesn't compete in powerlifting, but it's someone with just a very undisciplined diet. They're not the healthiest by anything, but because they fill the sleeves and they can bench a lot or squat a lot, they're considered, high level. They're considered an elite practitioner. But if you were to ask them to go demonstrate top end sprint mechanics, if you were to ask them to demonstrate change of direction, or to just have a conversation surrounding conditioning that wasn't solely on shuttle runs and gassers, and they say repeat sprint ability, but they actually don't know what that means. That's something where, unless we're willing to have these conversations and be open-minded and explore new ideas, then moving the needle forward on the industry, it's going to keep getting caught up on that. And I've had more than my share of coaches that have not taken well to my trolling and my memes on the internet, which, first of all, at the end of the day, they're just memes. It's not that serious. But also, if it is something that upsets you that much, is it not at least worth having the conversation and exploring? Because, I've gone down the rabbit hole on the strength side of things. I've done, when I was an undergrad, I went through doing the bro splits, the bodybuilding style training. I did the push pull legs, the upper lower, 5-3-1 APR. I've experimented with all these different methods, as have most coaches. And I think that's great because that's what you should do as a practitioner. You should be trialing stuff on yourself and seeing what works and how can you fit it into your athletic development model. But then when you suggest the idea that, hey, what if you incorporated a couple hours a week of just off the low intensity conditioning? And the immediate rebuttal is, no, we already get enough through our job, because yeah, if you're on floor as a collegiate strength coach, you're going to get anywhere from 15 to, I have a couple buddies that they're in fall camp right now for American football season, and he's getting like 23,000 steps a day. It's like, yes, you're accumulating a lot of on foot volume, but fundamentally it's not the same. There are, and that's the post I shared on the different drivers of cardiac output. There's a huge contribution of the autonomic nervous system where if the reason your heart rate's elevated in the context of your step count is from an activation of your sympathetic nervous system, you're jacked up on caffeine, you're screaming, you're running around, you're trying to motivate guys. That is just a completely different environment and not the same adaptations derived from true cyclical low intensity work that's going to help actually stimulate parasympathetic tone and help you recover from it. But I really do think just that one of the most frustrating parts of this is the lack of being open-minded to trialing this method that as it relates to conditioning, just at a pure level of, not even being willing to dedicate a month, but again, they'll dedicate months on end towards trying to get 10, 15 pounds on their squat max. And I've always been an advocate for like strength training is important. These things matter. But as strength and conditioning coaches, I do believe we have a responsibility to not only teach our athletes about improving performance, but also improving health. And those things don't need to be nearly as juxtaposed as they are. And we can build those in together, but that starts by embodying it ourselves. And so I'm not expecting a bunch of coaches walking around in single digit body fat percentages. And I think ironically, one of the biggest benefits of regular low intensity training is it allows you to do more high intensity work. It allows you to cover more, recover from it more quickly within the session and between sessions. So for these coaches that, they want to do the powerlifting, they want to do the Olympic lifting, the irony is that this training would help supplement them and support them and allow them to reach a higher peak. But because they're stuck in this dogmatic thinking, they keep their base limited and they continue to try to put a square peg into a round hole. So, for me, the number one thing is, and I've been very good about, it's the direction I've taken it where I will obviously share my messaging, I'll share my content, and I never share it as fact, right? I mean, obviously there's research to support it, but my whole thing is, the goal of science is to disprove science. And so part of that is through trialing stuff anecdotally, having the empirical research to support it. But I will share the information and I will have conversations with anyone that wants to have those dialogues. But at the end of the day, if someone is not willing to at least experiment with the training, I'm not going to sit there and lose sleep or like dig my feet in and try to argue with them because, if someone were to come with me with a different method for improving speed, power, strength, whatever it is, and there's, a host of evidence to support their argument, I'd be a fool to not explore that rabbit hole and go down that route. But then when we try to apply that to the C, there's just the amount of resistance to it is beyond absurd. And so it's crazy to me that you implore an endurance athlete to incorporate strength training. Generally, they're pretty open-minded to it. They'll give it a shot and they tend to see improvements from it with their rates of injury reduction and improvements in performance. But you tell a strength coach or a strength athlete to try doing some dedicated aerobic work, and it's like you kick their dog across the room and they're just the animosity they develop towards you is absurd.
Yeah, and I think it's that's all great. And one of the things I kind of want to say to listeners that are out there, not that numbers always necessarily matter, but just to assure people that Justin's not just this long distance guy that doesn't lift, and he's always just been a marathon runner. Go down his page, I've stalked it, and you'll see that his hip cleaning or hip power cleaning, 120 kilo, like he's put the work in, he understands both. And I think that's super important that we're not super stubborn in our approaches and just a trial and error, just play around because we don't know. Like we genuinely don't know what's on the other side. So yeah, where I was going with that before we kind of went off on one, which I love, by the way, was the Charles Poliquin side, and going back in the day, I think I just got my first personal trainer qualification. I was like, Charles Poliquin's the guy. He put up this post around, you've got the classic marathon runner on the right side, low intensity makes you lose muscle. Then you've got the sprinter on the other side, and it's high intensity. And back then I shared it, and I'm like, you need to do high intensity. Anything less than that, and you're just wasting muscle. Let's get into that a little bit, I think. So I guess first and foremost is, what are the adaptations around high intensity interval training, or the other side of that coin? And can we get the same adaptations that you got from low intensity with HIIT? Is that possible or not really?
In turn, there's overlap within adaptations, but I think we understand that, intensity is ultimately the stimulus that tells you what type of adaptation you're going to get, whether that's intensity of a 1 rep maximum or of your top velocity, however you're using that. And I think in the past 10 to 20 years, there's been this huge push for the HIIT movement, the high intensity interval trainings, your Tabata intervals. And one of my biggest frustrations, and I think for coaches, that if they're to read beyond the abstracts of articles, because you can go online, go on PubMed right now, and there'll be all these articles saying how HIIT improves aerobic fitness. And when you look at the actual study, the marker for aerobic fitness is VO2 max, which is solely indicative of just oxygen delivery. It has nothing to do with extraction or utilization rates. And so there's quite a few studies that actually look at the changes in cardiac structure and comparing, control groups to these HIIT groups. And there are no changes to the actual cardiac structure. So there's not improvements in end diastolic volume. There's not improvements in that left ventricular diameter. And so although their aerobic fitness as measured by VO2 max is going up, which VO2 max, and from what I've learned and understood, it's not as big of a concept over in Europe. It tends to be, heavily researched in American literature. But while that's improving, if you're not improving the underpinning elements, the structural elements to go with it, you're more of just capitalizing on the current metabolic infrastructure you have. And if it was as simple as I can do a 7-minute HIIT routine and that's the same as 60 minutes of cycling on a bike, I think from a conceptual standpoint, that would devalue everything we know about the impacts of intensity and volume, because then why would we spend all this time training? Why can't endurance athletes simply do a 7-minute HIIT workout instead of these long duration runs they're doing? And so, high intensity work is important. And that's where I think as our field has gone down the rabbit hole of reverse engineering the demands of sport, which I think is a great endeavor, because they're understanding it from more than just a general standpoint. They're looking at the time motion analysis and the amount of change of directions and all these different variables. But those are specific to the moderate and the high intensity elements, which you need for sport performance. But underpinning your recoverability of that and your ability to resynthesize phosphocreatine and reproduce those high intensity outputs is having the aerobic system to supply oxygen, because they've done studies where having people perform a sustained work rate, and one of them, it's performed in hypoxic conditions, so their oxygen saturation is like 20% lower, and the power output goes down with it, the sustained work rate goes down, the RER values go much higher, so they're burning a lot more glucose versus fat, and so when you look at that, you understand that it doesn't matter how high your maximal outputs are, you can express it one time, but if your sport success is predicated upon being able to repeat those efforts and knowing that when you throw an athlete on a basketball court or on a pitch, yes, we have our average demands, but they're just that. They're averages. They're not representative of what they're actually going to face. And the more specific you get in your training without building up this base of what I just consider robustness to demands, what happens when the sport takes them outside of those demands? What happens when, the research said they're going to have a repeat sprint of 3 to 5 seconds every 6 to 8 minutes? What happens when all of a sudden they have a sprint duration of 10 to 15 seconds and they only have 20 seconds rest and they have to repeat it again? And how we train them to recover from that. And again, the amount of volume you can accumulate from something like low intensity without it impacting their overall fatigue and stress is where the value lies in, because these athletes need to be good at their sport. They need the skill work. And a lot of that skill work is going to take place in moderate to high intensity ranges. And it needs to. In order for it to transfer, you can't practice a skill at 50% speed all of the time and then expect to be able to execute it going full speed and under those fatigued elements. And so that's where it's, keep the sport, develop those actions as you need. and then supplement that outside of it with this low intensity conditioning to one, promote recovery, and then two, allow you to do more of that sport work that's going to make you successful.
Man, that's awesome. I think one of the things I really liked about what you said there was the recoverability of it. You know, the fact that it doesn't tax you to the same degree as going out and, you know, trying to do a Tabata or, you know, string multiple Tabatas together, whatever that high intensity method does look like for you. And I'm going to butcher who said this, but essentially, if we think about sport generally living in the middle ground, you know, and as S&C coaches, it'd be good for us as a good, you know, performance strategy to target below that point and target above that point, because chances are in sports practice, they never actually go 100%. They never actually touch those outputs that they need to actually develop those outputs in the first place. And you might know who that was, I'm not too sure, but I feel like that's probably quite a common philosophy in our industry. I don't know. I feel like it is.
Yeah, no, and again, that's, been the latest push, I'll say, especially within American strength conditioning, is the value of true sprint work. Like there's so many coaches that especially from reducing the incidence of hamstring injuries, like we've seen the value of sprinting, but also as a physical stimulus, nothing comes close to the stimulus provided by top end sprinting. And so we've seen the importance of going above the demands of the game. And we understand that obviously there's an inverse relationship between intensity and volume. And so while we've mastered one end of it, you see people now emphasizing the importance of developing top end speed, there's not enough people willing to go on the lower end of it and appreciate how truly low you need to go there. And again, that's something where as a practitioner, applying it yourself is the first step and the most important step. And that's why I was very good about, making my own data public and actually putting the results of pre and post, the heart rate data with it of the same conditioning test, because that way it's not just me, some guy airing off my opinion. It's no, I put myself through this. I was doing, 4 to 6 hours of dedicated low intensity work each week. And then I replicated the same test, and the demands of the task were, my average heart rate was down by 20 beats per minute to complete the same outcome, which means that from a metabolic standpoint, that activity was of a much lower cost to me. So I can sustain it for longer and I can repeat it for longer, which, assuming that's our goal, is to be more physically prepared than our opponent, that would seem like a good thing to me.
And the other thing that you put in the Blue Crew, which I really liked, was around the skills element, around the free throws, and basically just doing your skills better. So give us a little bit of background around that, because it's kind of one of those common sense things, but I think it's kind of nice to back that up with a little bit of research as well.
Yeah, and so that was, me being a basketball player myself, it's easy to understand that literature, but there was 2 different studies, one by Ardigo, I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, and another one by Padullo. And one looked at 3-point jump shooting accuracy. The other one looked at about a 15-foot jump shot, and they would shoot from 5 different spots, and they measured it at a resting heart rate level, at 50% of their heart rate max, and then at 80% of their heart rate max. And from the resting to the 50%, there's very minimal drop off in their shooting accuracy. But then once you get to that 80% of max heart rate, which when you look at research surrounding the physiological demands of competition, that tends to be where a lot of those athletes live in. And so again, if we understand what's happening to the muscles at the cellular level, so we understand the effects of not so much lactate, but with lactate, there's the accumulation of hydrogen ions that throw off the pH of the muscle and affect the contractility of it. That's where we understand that our inability to clear lactate and to turn it into usable energy as quickly as possible so that we're not getting that increase in hydrogen ions with it is so integral to performance, because no matter how capable you are when you're fresh, I mean, you can go to a local public gym and there's probably some like 70, 75-year-old guy who he can sit at the free throw line and just hit shot after shot. The technique might not be great, but he'll hit 20, 25 in a row. But that's not what underpins performance, and that's not the context it's going to have in the game, where you might go up and down the court 5 or 6 times, you get fouled on a layup. You've got 20 to 30 seconds to recover, relax, lock in, and hit the shot. But if you're not recovering from a metabolic sense, even though you might be, robust to the demands of the game, and yeah, you have great shooting technique, but when you're in that situation where there is all this accumulation of metabolites and that's affecting the muscle's abilities to contract, your technique and your performance is going to go down with it. And so in these studies, they would see, close to 10 to 12% reductions in accuracy from that 50% mark from the 50% heart rate to the 80% heart rate. And so our goal should be is, enhancing that 60-second heart rate recovery, because that lets us know when we have those stoppages in play. And then, for something like basketball, a free throw, or in the sport, maybe like soccer, then you have a penalty kick or a free kick. How quickly can you get your heart rate to come down so that you're in a position where now you can execute that skill with a much higher level of accuracy? But at the end of the day, all the practice in the world does not, eliminate the need for reducing that heart rate and being able to perform the skill, because it's just something you cannot physically overcome. It's kind of like the old the mental toughness battle, which is a huge thing in American strength and conditioning of, if we just make kids mentally tough, they can push through anything. And it's like, no, you can be mentally tough all you want, however you want to define that, but you need to be physically prepared, technically prepared. Otherwise, if it was just simple as like, who's the toughest, our jobs would not be anywhere nearly as complex and nuanced as they are. And, there's some other research I've been looking at lately that showed, the different effects on, the supplemental motor area and the, different areas of the brain, and how when it's exposed to these like high levels of lactate, it's kind of a protective mechanism that takes place there, acutely, and I don't want to say long-term, but the immediate after effect as well. And so both neurologically and then just metabolically, it's a barrier to executing the skill itself that, yeah, you might be able to overcome it from time to time. But if we're playing an odds game and we're playing a likelihood game, we want to conduct training and create a robust athlete that we're increasing the odds and we're putting them in a position where if their game speed and the cost of that game speed is much lower than their opponents, we're increasing their accuracy, we're increasing the likelihood of successful outcomes.
Mate, I love it. I absolutely love it. And I feel like that's a really good point to end on. I feel like we've touched a lot of different points here. And that was an absolute masterclass, to be honest with you. And I'm absolutely chuffed with it. I just want to thank you again for coming on the podcast, mate. I know it is super early. Is it 5 now, 5:30 for you?
5:20, but yeah. I'm always up this early anyway, so it's more than happy. Yeah, more than happy to be up this early. So I used to be a late night guy, and working in this job, you learn to love early mornings.
I bet. Where can people find out a little bit more about you, mate, and what you're doing?
I'm most active on Instagram. My handle is j.c.kuehn. My last name Kuehn. That's where I'm most active on. I'm most responsive on. I'm also on Twitter, but truthfully, I use that app once a month, maybe more to keep up with all the trolling of the industry. But that's the best spot to reach me, through DM. That's where all my content's available that I regularly push stuff out on. And my book's available through there as well. I have a link tree in my bio. There's a free chapter for those who aren't maybe fully sold on it yet. You can download. But any questions can be directed to me through messaging there. I'm usually good about getting back within 48 to 72 hours. Just between work and life, I'm not always the best about checking it, but I do try to get back within 2 to 3 days.
Amazing, mate. Thank you very much. I'll put all your information in the show notes below so people can just click straight through. But yeah, once again, mate, thank you for that. That was absolutely quality.
Thanks for having me on, man. Really appreciated it.
Thanks for listening to the Adapt Performance podcast. Let me know what you thought about the episode by leaving a review or sending me a direct message. I'm all for receiving the honest feedback to make sure the episodes grow and get better and better. Like, share, subscribing and following all goes a long way to making sure the podcast reaches the right people. Thanks a lot. Catch you next time.